let me speak a name. Just any old name. You may have heard of them. Telltale Games. When you hear that infamous name, I'm sure many thoughts spring to the front of your mind. The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, Game of Thrones, hell, maybe even Tales from the Borderlands. Telltale's ventures inspired many and have stuck with many more to this day, including myself. Telltale is a legendary company in gaming, holding so much clout that even EA couldn't buy them. Well, as pretty much everyone who's ever played a Telltale game knows by now, the company went the way of the dodo pretty recently. When I heard the news, I was completely shocked. It seemed like everything was going fine for the company, like nothing could stop them. Telltale seemed to me, and to many others I know, well, to be invincible. But corporate mismanagement, poor structure, and serious lack of creativity led to Telltale's rapid downfall. I'm way late to this topic, and many people have done a full deconstruction of how it happened already. So in contrast to my look on why the Dreamcast died, I want to offer more of my own spin on things, my own opinion. So, without any further ado, let's find out, how did Telltale Games die, and why did it die so quickly? The year was 2004. It all started in San Rafael, California. Kevin Bruner, Dan Connors, and Troy Melander, the founders of the company, had an idea. Hey, what if we made a game company? One pitched. The others simply nodded, and well, Telltale was born. These three men had met through their former work as LucasArts employees, working on the adventure-style games that LucasArts developed at the time. The men wanted originally to develop a Sam & Max game in the classic now, Telltale episodic format. The men realized that although the Sam & Max fandom may have been small, it would allow them to most likely acquire the licensing at a cheaper cost, and they could probably reap the juicy rewards of game development without handing over wads of cash to the owners of the Sam & Max brand. The men realized they couldn't do it themselves. With licensing for the Sam & Max video games still in the hands of their former employers at LucasArts, and the men lacking the funding, resources, and equipment required to truly develop their own Sam & Max game, they tried to negotiate with LucasArts. After some rather short talks with LucasArts, they refused to negotiate handing over the license or developing a sequel to Sam & Max Freelance Police, the game that inspired these men to make their own. So, the men played the waiting game. As they did nothing with the company they founded for many months, in 2005 it finally happened. Steve Purcell, the creator of the Sam & Max likeness entirely, offered Telltale the licensing of his characters, ending a standoff between Telltale and LucasArts. The men immediately set off on accomplishing their goal of a fully realized Sam & Max title. Well, they would have if they could. See, they still lacked the resources and sheer manpower to develop this game. They needed to narrow their horizons to less grand projects as a niche Sam & Max game. Well, anyway, they wanted to get the funds required to expand the company before pursuing their goal of a Sam & Max title. Humble beginnings never hurt anyone. They set to work on an unbranded card game called Telltale Texas Hold'em. This game wasn't as notable as their other games, and as they continued making small moves and creating small projects, they finally did it. They had officially secured Sam & Max's licensing, and they were ready to take on their dream project. In an episodic format, out of the dust, blood, sweat, and tears of Telltale came Sam & Max Season 1. It is today regarded as a huge success for the fledgling company, as considered one of the few successful applications of an episodic formula in video games up to that point. The success of this video game attracted many angel investors and more funding, allowing them to create Sam & Max Season 2, continuing the story of the previous season. As the company broadened their horizons once again, they took over more niche video gaming areas with Homestar Runner and Wallace & Gromit video games, further bringing fame and wealth to Telltale's name. LucasArts even stepped in and offered Telltale the chance to make a sequel to The Curse of Monkey Island, which they did by creating The Tales of Monkey Island. By 2010, the men, at this point it was a fully fledged studio, Telltale left the comfortable realm of PC titles and expanded onto the various home consoles available at the time. Up to this point, Telltale was regarded as a company that created video games based mostly on comedy franchises. Sam & Max and Tales of Monkey Island were their two big projects at this point, and both of them were comedy games. Telltale wanted to diversify their games and shift away from the label of comedy game creator. They picked up the license to make games based on Back to the Future and Jurassic Park, starting with Jurassic Park the game. This game wasn't as successful as their Back to the Future project. It was the first to include different elements that were non-standard to Telltale's standard adventure style. The game included quick time events and limited time dialogue choices, which would become Telltale Games staples on all projects following. Where the money was really at, however, was the Back to the Future game. This game was more of a cult classic hit than a mainstream success, yet the game drew a lot of money for Telltale and introduced a lot of people to, at the time, the burgeoning company. This was not their big hit, though. Not by a long shot. Their big hit would come shortly after, in the year of 2012. You probably came into this video already knowing what it was, but wondering when it'd be mentioned. Well, we saved the best for last, or I guess in this case, the middle. Either way, enough posturing. Without further ado, I present to you... The Walking Dead Season 1 was an absolute masterpiece. Sean Vanaman's writing brought a whole new take to Telltale. The game wasn't based on solving puzzles to continue like their previous adventure games were. The game was a branching epic of a story presented in Telltale's unique, if a bit dated, art style. The game has a charm to it. It has a very dark and depressing story, set in the Walking Dead universe, but the game looks just cartoonish enough and has just enough humorous breaks in the plot that it's still enjoyable. The Walking Dead heavily utilized quick-time events and time-limited dialogue choices, which made the game feel realer and feel like your choices had an impact. Speaking of choice, Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1 had a load of it. Everyone knows the Telltale meme that your choices don't matter in the end, and to an extent they don't. The game still ends the same way, and the choices don't have too serious of an impact on gameplay. The illusion of choice that the player receives is enough to keep them hooked. The Walking Dead masterfully encapsulates the player with a cinematic, story-driven experience while still making the player feel like they're in the story, like Lee is an embodiment of them. There are some choices in The Walking Dead that truly matter. The way you act in Lee's shoes can change relationships, and those changed relationships can determine whether or not you're together as a group or you're all alone, fighting for survival. Lee, as a character, is, well, it's brilliant character design. His backstory is vague enough that if the player so chooses, he can apply his own extended lore onto Lee. He has no set attitude or qualities besides that he was a professor in Atlanta and killed a man who was sleeping with his wife. Those are big, but also vague enough to where it doesn't show enough that Lee acts a certain way, leaving room for the player to become Lee. Lee's idea as a character sums up what I think Telltale is itself. Telltale doesn't have its own worlds, crafted from inside and out as their franchise, built from the ground up by brilliant minds. No. What they have is a company of brilliant minds twisting the foundations of licensed brands to create unique stories that fit into the world of the licenses they've acquired. Telltale is the player. They take blank slate IPs and mold them into what they feel best represents their license. Telltale is Lee. I could go on about The Walking Dead Season 1 for days. It's my favorite Telltale game, followed pretty closely by Tales from the Borderlands, which deserves its own analysis video in its own right. The game is a true masterpiece, but you don't need to hear that from me. It's hard to believe that the company that's made some of the games that have defined my years since I picked up gaming, the company that popularized episodic content in gaming, and changed adventure game design forever is just gone. A flash in the pan. The company that seems like one of the more successful video game studios ever is just gone. Let's delve into why they disappeared so fast. Telltale's management was less than effective. Something that only came out post-death was the fact that Telltale's employees were on constant crunch time. CEO Kevin MacLeod believed that Telltale had the manpower to churn out multiple big releases and various smaller side projects all in the same year. This recipe led to constant overworking and overtime of everyone who worked for Telltale. According to some sources, the happiness of Telltale's employees was at a bare minimum. The employees were not placated, and management was doing nothing to placate them. The company was at a standstill about what in particular to do about this problem. Kevin MacLeod wasn't budging and had a firm stance, and as employee numbers dwindled due to firings and even quitting, some investors that were keeping the company alive started pulling. See, the company had to pay a lot of money to acquire the licenses needed to legally develop and sell games like The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, Back to the Future, and Tales from the Borderlands. All these are big-name licenses and as such have big price tags attached. To do this, the company had numerous investors. Anyone they could find that was interested in a stake of Telltale was welcomed in with open arms. The company simply couldn't decline any investors. As those investors that kept the company afloat started pulling funding out of fear of losses, the company's funds started drastically decreasing. Bruner realized the company needed to enter a period of reconstruction, and as such he began to lead Telltale into the dark, treacherous territory of a company rebuild. His plans were to endure a short period of unprofitability and rebound with a full company reconstruction and a ton of profitability by the time the reconstruction was completed. The company began cutting many positions, laying off many people and losing a lot of workers in an attempt to retain as much money as possible during the turbulent times of reconstruction. The reconstruction backfired pretty severely, however. Unexpectedly to the general public and seemingly Bruner himself, his destructive plan to rebuild via layoffs backfired. On September 21st, 2018, Bruner announced a studio closure, laying off nearly 90% of its current workforce, all on that same day, with very short notice for the employees, with the remaining 25 or so employees simply remaining to fulfill their bargains with investors and their board. This sudden death of Telltale was caused when their last major investor pulled on the company, some theorized to be Lionsgate, and Telltale simply couldn't sustain active work on any more projects in the future. With this sobering news, the game world recoiled in shock as the company followed this announcement, shortly after with a full destruction of the company. Reportedly, the workers still present were given a mere 30 minutes notice to pack their things and leave the building with no severance and very little time on their promised healthcare beneficiary plan. Melissa Hutchison, voice actor of Clementine from The Walking Dead, even stated that this news came in the middle of a recording session for The Walking Dead Season 4, which they had to end shortly thereafter. Telltale was officially dead, and with it, many game series are most likely to be left on a permanent cliffhanger. Tales from the Borderlands, one of my favorite games to date, will most likely never get finished. A sad ending to a tale that was seemingly not fully told.